This video covers chapter 7.3 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. This chapter explains how to use MapStruct library to map DTOs into entities. To use the MapStruct library, you need to create an interface, and inside this interface you declare methods that make the conversion between different classes, in our case, from DTO to entities. These methods will automatically map properties with the same name, or you can annotate those methods to map properties with different names. The benefit of using this MapStruct library is that it doesn't change entities at all, they remain the same, but still uses simplicity of annotations inside the interface to define mappings. So here is a simple example of how MapStruct can be used. So let's start with our DTO that has following properties which we want to use to create this author entity and this book entity by mapping these properties DTO into these author properties and this DTO property into this book property. As you can see, we didn't have to introduce any changes to either DTO or any of the two entities. This is unlike the previous example where we were using JMapper, which use annotations in destination object, or in this case, author and book entities. So the JMapper, in order to operate, you need to introduce JMap annotations to the properties of entities. So with MapStruct, our entities remain the same. So here is the interface that we need to define in order to use JMapper. It starts with a property that simply returns the instance of this interface so that we can actually use it. And then inside the interface, we can define methods that do the mapping. So in here, we have one method, this one here, declare, and another method. So this mapper method is used to map DTO to author, and DTO is input parameter. And this method will be used to map DTO to book, where DTO again is a parameter. So as already said, JMapper will automatically map properties that have the same name. So this method will automatically map title property of the book with title property of the DTO. And in this method, we have annotated with these two annotations which define custom mappings, where properties have different names. So this first annotation says that DTO property author name should be mapped to the author property name. So this author name. So this is supposed to be author name property in a DTO. And with this annotation, we are telling that it should be mapped to name property of the author. And the next annotation is saying that author age DTO property should be mapped to age property of the author. This author age property we want to map with this age property of the author. So these properties have different names, and we can then map names by using mapping annotation with these two attributes. Now inside the controller, to use the JMapper, first we have to get the instance as defined here. And this is now the instance of our JMapper. And then we can use these two methods to actually do the mapping. We can call this method to get the book entity from the DTO, and we can call this method to get author entity from the DTO. Now, in order for JMapper to work, we need to add this dependency, map struct. We also need to add this plugin to POM.xml, and we must define this property, which is referenced from here. So this is in a very short way how the JMapper works. And now we will show a more detailed example of how to use JMapper. So this is how our application will look like. We will send a JSON string that looks like this, which will be automatically mapped into this DTO inside the controller. Then we will use JMapper to map this DTO into author and book entities. And this mapping will be done inside the controller's endpoint by using this generated class, which was generated from the interface that we have created and in which we have defined those two methods that do the actual mapping. So let's take a closer look at the classes. So we have these DTO, author, and book entity classes, which we have already covered in the introduction. And we want to map these DTO properties to these author properties and this DTO property to this book property. We have already seen that we need to create this interface. We need to create interface which needs to be annotated with mapper annotation. Inside it, we need to create a property that will hold the instance of the class that will implement this interface. And then we defined methods that will do the actual mapping and which we have already covered in the introduction. And then in my controller, we create an endpoint that receives this DTO from the JSON string. And as already discussed, we create instance of our JMapper and then simply called our methods from the interface to map DTO into book entity or to map, and the other method to map DTO into author entity. This application can be tested by using Postman and to create a post HTTP request and then to call endpoint URL. And then inside the body, we can send this JSON string. And our endpoint will then return this string as constructed here from our entities, which were created by mapping DTO properties to each of these entities. Before you run the project, you have to rebuild it in order for this auto-generated class to be created from the interface. And this is how this class will look like. It will have our two methods, and JMapper will automatically create bodies for these classes, their implementation, they do the mapping. As defined by our annotations, it will map author name of DTO to name property of author, and the author age of DTO to age of author, and title of DTO to book title. As defined here with our annotations, and here when the property names were the same. So yeah, Just remember that POM.xml needs to be updated with these values, this property, this dependency, and this plugin here.